feed your head, engage your brain, and enter the mind's eye. In Audiotorium of Awakenings, I'm your host, DJ BJ Turnov, and you're listening to Stitcher Radio and Z-Talk Radio. We got 90 minutes tonight to celebrate 50 years of Slaughterhouse-Five by one of my favorite authors, Kurt Vonnegut. His works often mixed reality and fiction, but there was something so real, so authentic, so relatable about him. Vonnegut didn't shy away from writing about his faults, his demons, his issues, and the pain from his own life's events. But in between the heartache and the despair, there was always these great moments of love and friendship and tenderness. Our little ditty of a podcast here definitely draws a lot of inspiration from Vonnegut. Often here on the show, we take an unconventional look at history or shine a different light on some well-known topic. Vonnegut explored so many different, whether it was the American dream or writing about his own experiences at the bombing of Dresden. Vonnegut's perspective was alternative, so he made you look at the world alternatively. Most representative of this is his semi-autobiographical masterpiece, Slaughterhouse-Five, which might be one of the best books ever written about World War II and the war experience, even though it is partly fiction. Helping us to observe this special literary anniversary, we have Dr. Gregory Sumner, Fulbright Scholar, Professor and Co-Chair of History at the University of Detroit Mercy, and author of the book Unstuck in Time, Take a Journey Through Kurt Vonnegut's Life and Novels. When we come back, Dr. Gregory Sumner is going to paint a poignant picture of Vonnegut, his personal life, wartime experiences, and his own struggles with his own patriotism. Pretty much all things Vonnegut. Get trapped in the amber of the moment after this commercial break with The Mind's Eye on Stitcher Radio and Z-Talk Radio. We're back here on The Mind's Eye on Stitcher Radio and Z-Talk Radio. Keeping with the idea of looking at history through a different lens, we just posted an interesting article on an upcoming documentary about research suggesting Revolutionary War General Casimir Pulaski, a.k.a. father of the American cavalry, may have been intersex. This is based on evidence gathered from skeletal remains believed to be Pulaski's that had both female and male biological characteristics. Read the article now. It's posted on our Twitter and Facebook pages at Mind's Eye Show. And as always, it's on our website too, themindseyemedia.com, themindseyemedia.com. The Mind's Eye returns with Dr. Gregory Sumner as we take a journey through Kurt Vonnegut's life and novels on the 50th anniversary of Slaughterhouse-Five. The Mind's Eye is getting trapped in the amber of the moment with the good Dr. Gregory Sumner, author of Unstuck in Time, a journey through Kurt Vonnegut's life and novels. Welcome to the show, Greg.
Thanks, Brian. Great to be here.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. And but before we talk about Vonnegut, let's talk about Sumner. Greg, where have you been all our lives? Give us a quick biographical snapshot.
Well, people ask me why I wrote a book about Kurt Vonnegut. And one is, he is the only person I know who survived the apocalypse and lived to write about it. But secondly, he's from my hometown. I actually grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana, which Vonnegut had a kind of love-hate relationship with, as it's sort of a strange place to be from. So I'm a Midwesterner. I've lived the last 25 years in Detroit, Metro Detroit. But I am from Vonnegut's hometown, and I know what it's like to be from that place.
Now, you said Vonnegut had a bit of a love-hate relationship with the city. What about the city? How does it feel about Vonnegut?
Interesting. I would say, again, kind of mixed emotions. Now things are pretty hunky-dory. There's a love affair between Indianapolis and its, one of its most famous native sons. But for a long time, first of all, he worked in obscurity for so long. I was just reading, we're talking about the 50th anniversary of Slaughterhouse-Five. Mm-hmm. He actually showed up at the big department store, LS Ayres, for a book signing when Slaughterhouse came out in the spring of, I think it was the spring of '69, and no one showed up. I mean, no one, which is kind of crazy because a little bit later it took off. The other thing about Indianapolis, it is a red state, and Vonnegut had these kind of socialist ideas, atheism. He had some ideas that were not congruent with red state ideas so much. So, and he used bad words occasionally, which he would talk about. This embarrassed my aunt and my uncle and so forth, and they won't read me anymore. So it's kind of interesting. His Midwesternness and the kind of, embarrassed quality of that is exactly what drew me to him. But he also, he moved to New York. He was a creature of New York. He had broader horizons. And there was a time he really didn't want to go back that often to Indianapolis. Didn't know anybody there. Would say, when I go back, I got to see him speak twice in Indianapolis. And one time he spoke to a pretty big crowd at a high school, and they're enjoying this famous author. I don't know how many had actually read his books, but he spun around at one point and said, why did you people tear down all of my grandfather's beautiful buildings downtown to build parking lots? And you could almost hear a pin drop, because he would do these talks where he would kind of like a showman, a kind of a vaudeville artist, and he'd draw shapes of stories. But you had to see Vonnegut in person, and his 2 times I saw him in Indianapolis, both times he challenged the crowd, a lot of whom just showed up to see who this famous guy was. The other time I saw him, by the way, in Indianapolis was right after the first Gulf War in '91. And he spun around at one point, literally kind of gets people laughing. Then he wants to deliver his message. He was appalled by, the annihilation of these Iraqi guys from the air. And Vonnegut, I just remember very clearly, he said to this crowd of about 2,000 Indianapolis people, when I saw those young kids, Iraqi kids, teenagers with their arms up, scared, marching, I said to myself, those are my brothers. And so, this was not the typical kind of sentiment, and I noticed a kind of mixed reaction in the crowd. So he had very progressive ideas in a place that's not really known for those.
And that's kind of in the same way that he would do his speeches. That's kind of what his writing was. He'd make you laugh a little bit, and then he would just deliver that devastating message, and it would just kind of blow you away. So I'm not surprised by that at all.
Right. He talked about the science fiction interventions in Slaughterhouse-Five. He said those are kind of like the clowns in Shakespeare's plays. When things get a little bit heavy, I bring in something lighter, and then I go back to the message that I want to deliver. I've talked to many people who say Cat's Cradle, that's my favorite Vonnegut book. And what I say about it is it's great, and he loved it too. He maybe thought it was his best book. And you're laughing all the way, but if you remember at the end, the world is destroyed. Mm-hmm. So I compare it to Dr. Strangelove, which came out at about the same time in the early 60s as, actually the same year, I think, as Cat's Cradle. And you're laughing all the way to Armageddon, So, yeah, he deals with the most fundamental ideas, and he's not all that optimistic quite a bit of the time. But he wraps them in simple language, very accessible, and uses humor, of course, to deliver those messages.
And you just said that he considered, Cat's Cradle probably to be his best work or his favorite. What's your favorite?
Well, don't we always love our first love? It's interesting. When I wrote my book, Unstuck in Time, I read and wrote a chapter each on all 14 of Vonnegut's novels. And I handed them into my editor in New York, and he wrote back and said, some of the chapters are better than the others. It seems like the books you really like, you write really better chapters, and you got to fall in love with all of them. So, everybody has their list and everybody has their favorite. And I'll never understand why people choose Sirens of Titan as their favorite. Although with several rereadings, I get it now. It's not my favorite. I would say Breakfast of Champions, which is something I read in the mid-1970s. And the first couple, 3 pages, he's turning history upside down. He's doing these doodles. And it's so uncompromising that I just fell in love with that. That was my entry drug to Kurt Vonnegut. I like a lot of the books, a lot of the 14. I love Mother Night, which fits together like a watch, the story of Howard W. Campbell Jr., the American posing as a Nazi and so forth. And by the way, they made a pretty good movie about Mother Night. And the other one I would put in my front rank of the 14 novels would be a later one that maybe not as many people have read, Bluebeard, which is a love story of sorts about an older guy falling in love. And I just find it so touching and humane. And I guess I'm a sucker for a love story. Vonnegut was suspicious of love. And I say in my book, he finally was able to write a real love story. And that's Bluebeard, 1987.
I'm kind of like you with the entry. Breakfast of Champions was the first one that I read too, so that's always kind of my favorite as well. I think most people obviously read Slaughterhouse-Five first, just because it's considered a masterpiece. But I'm like you too. So I mean, you can obviously tell that you have a real affinity for the man. What does he mean to you when you hear the name Vonnegut? What's kind of some of the first things that just pop up in your mind?
Well. What I say, and I've talked to many people who are like Vonnegut. I think the first few pages you read, you hear this voice come through clearly, and I just think of his sanity. He's like an uncle who's going to guide me through the craziness of these recent decades, who I trust, and he's going to tell me the truth, and he's also going to remain. Here's a guy who experienced this monstrous event, World War II, and he did not become a monster. I think he called himself, I'm an optimist pretending to be a pessimist, or he's a sentiment. I like the sentimental side. I have to admit that. So I find this very soft, but also I guess I'm looking at an older man. And I think everybody who reads Vonnegut and falls in love with Vonnegut recognizes that voice. That voice of credibility, and not pompous, not stiff, and not like you think of a lot of grown-ups. He's somebody you want to. While the rest of the family's in the family reunion in the other room, I'd be in the room with Vonnegut. Just wanting to hear what he had to say, and I think a lot of people would agree with that.
And I'm one of them myself over here, obviously. You're just putting everything I have in my mind just eloquently put out there, so I appreciate that, because I sure can't. So all right, let's talk a little bit more about his actual life. Obviously, we're going to talk a lot about Slaughterhouse-Five and World War II, but let's talk a little bit about his early days. What was his childhood like, teenage years? Tell me about those days.
Well, I should first say, again, to self-identify, I'm an historian. I am not a literary person per se. And so I was really interested in Vonnegut, his biography, almost more than his books. And I kind of tell his life story and the evolution of his thinking through the books. I come at him as a historian. And it's interesting. I never got to meet Kurt Vonnegut. We had a little, he was very kind in replying to a couple of my letters late in his life. And I wrote him and I said, I'd like to write a biography of yours, about you. Would you be willing to cooperate? And, oh, sure, anything for a guy from Indianapolis and so forth. And he said, and I'll never forget it, he said, he wrote in his little, typewritten letter, he said, I got to warn you, if you try to write about my life, it's going to be like the time I tried to write a script for a screen production of The French Lieutenant's Woman. He said, everything happened in people's heads. Nothing really happened in real life. My life has been kind of like that. So he was always diffident. He was always very thinking, nothing much interesting happened in my life. Yeah. And of course, I flipped that and say, my God, again, he walked through the apocalypse, etc. He grew up in a very privileged world, German-American family, very, very I would say, wealthy, actually, in the early years of his life. His father and grandfather were architects. His grandfather on his mother's side owned a brewery. The first 7 years of his life, he was born in 1922. He often described that was heaven. I had all these relatives around me, and I, felt very secure. But there's also the theme of loss that intrudes very early in Vonnegut's life. The first loss, I would say, had to do with his parents, who he talked about the very bad effect World War I had on German Americans in this country, which I knew about, but to hear how it affected a family makes it more real. He said, my parents kind of lobotomized themselves, as so many Germans did, and walked away from their German culture. So they didn't pass it along to myself and my two siblings. That wasn't completely true, but so he was born on Armistice Day, 4 years, 1922, after the end of the Great War. And, this is a family, though, very prominent, 100% German. Then the stock market crash hit. And Vonnegut always said the most important event in my life was not really World War II. I was already a formed person by then. It wasn't Dresden. That's what most people think it is. They said what really shaped me was being a child of the Great Depression. So again, I was very interested in how he navigated that as a young man, as a teenager growing up in Indianapolis. And his father, who was an architect, really never had a job worthy of his talents from 1929 to 1945. His mother never could adapt to the idea that they had to sell their house, move into a smaller house, sell off China, become charge account deadbeats. It was humiliating for the family. So loss is a very big motif in his life.
She committed suicide, and many think that the financial part of that was a big reason. What do you think? Is that true?
There's quite a bit of circumstantial evidence that she dealt with the Depression and the idea that they had to sell off things and had reduced circumstances. She had been, quote, the richest girl in town and had this society wedding, and she never really got over that. Yeah, she dealt with it much less well than her husband, who kind of accepted what happened. So, the thinking is, I think her mental state and her mood deteriorated through the 30s, and she, of course, died on Mother's Day, 1944, and just a few months before Kurt himself went to Europe. A lot of people think his getting ready to be deployed to the war zone was maybe the final blow to her. Barbiturates, alcohol, was it an accident? She was not in great shape. And of course, it seems that there is a strain of kind of depression and mood disorders in the family. So all of those could have come together. But yeah, to have your mother do that or just die in that manner on Mother's Day, this was an unresolved relationship in Kurt's life that I'm sure affected all of his relationships with women, and comes out in his books too, the women in his books.
Now his mother also, she was, I think he kind of, do you think he got his writing chops from his mom? Because she was a bit of a writer, although unsuccessful. Although you could have considered Vonnegut unsuccessful for 15 years or so before Slaughterhouse.
Yeah, he was an overnight success at almost 50 years old. Well, Kurt, I call him Kurt. I didn't call him that in the book. I'm too familiar. But in Indianapolis, we don't do that. Kurt Vonnegut used to. I love all.
Wait. What do you mean? What don't you do? You don't call him by Kurt. You just say Vonnegut.
We're not. I wouldn't be so familiar with him. I'm sort of embarrassed when I'm calling him Kurt.
Well, I think from being from the same town and writing a biography, I think if anyone can do it, we can allow it for you. But sorry about that. So he got his writing chops from his mother. You think overnight success?
As I was writing my book, I was alert for any kind of aphorism or catchy line that I could use. And this is one that stuck with me, and I put it in the book. Young boys grow up to try to live out their mother's impossible dreams. Now, doesn't that sound like Kurt Vonnegut? That could have been in any one of his 14 novels. Boys grow up to try to live out their mother's impossible dreams. That was his case. As you say, she was both his parents were highly educated. She tried, to her credit, to make money writing stories for magazines in the 30s. And as you say, she failed. She wasn't able to write what the market demanded. And famous, Kurt Vonnegut in an interview said, "My mother didn't have the necessary vulgarity to succeed in the marketplace writing stories for magazines." And he said, "Fortunately, I'm loaded with vulgarity, so I did a lot better in the 50s and beyond." And he did make a pretty good up and down living, but that's how he kind of survived in the 50s and 60s, writing stories for Collier's and Saturday Evening Post and these magazines. So in a way, you could say that maybe the writing bug and the writing, she modeled that idea to him. And so maybe he is fulfilling his mother's impossible dream in some way.
And that dream was, it was fulfilled with the start at the masterpiece, the Slaughterhouse-Five. And let's set the scene here a little bit. Like so many of his generation, he was still a kid when he went to war. And these wartime experiences, you said people think that although they were the most influential, they weren't, but they definitely carved out a lot of his life philosophy. Talk about the World War II, the experiences that he had there, and what they were like, and how that much of an impact that had on him.
Again, this is a man who he was very diffident and sort of self-deprecating, and his picture of himself, including his picture, kind of Billy Pilgrim of Slaughterhouse-Five as an alter ego, as this bumbling child. I think that's not exactly true. One thing I would say is I do think World War II had a heck of an impact on him, and Dresden had a terrible impact on him. And maybe he was repressing that a little bit when he said, "No, I'm really a child of the Great Depression." He always pictured himself in interviews and in certainly, if you take Billy Pilgrim as young Kurt Vonnegut, he's like this clownishly inept waif in the middle of this terrible war. He's a ridiculous character, and he's just kind of bounced around by the forces. But if you actually look at Vonnegut's career as a prisoner of war, for instance, he wrote a letter to his family when he finally got to a Red Cross station in May of 45. He was finally able to write to his family back in Indianapolis after no word for 6 months. And if you read that letter, he said, he talked about the Germans, and he said, "The city was destroyed, but not me." 3 pretty heavy words, not me, but not me. He talks about, I kind of was the elected leader of our group because I could speak a little German. And he said, I challenged the guards on how they were treating us, and I got beat up a little. This is not Billy Pilgrim. I think the reality is a little more complex than that. But Vonnegut always liked to say, I didn't know what the heck I was doing in the war. He'd been trained in the howitzer, and this big field artillery piece, and then he said they needed bodies of the lowest grades by 1944. They told us college kids, he would gone to Cornell, "You'll never be promoted." They made him a rifleman. They made him a scout, 6'3" guy. He had no training when he was thrown into this winter of 1944 scene, the frozen landscape of Belgium and Holland. And he talked about it. He said, I was a scout. I couldn't, in this snowstorm, when the Germans counterattacked, the famous Battle of the Bulge of December of 44, he said, I couldn't find our lines, let alone, the Germans' lines. And someone asked him, well, what did you do? You didn't really have the training. You're out there. It's bad conditions. The line I like, he said, I imitated various war movies I had seen. And he always painted himself as a rather bumbling figure. But I think that's not entirely the case. And, he later in his life, he's very proud of his military service. He once said, when I die, I want the full military honors. If you go to the Kurt Vonnegut museum in Indianapolis, which I urge all Vonnegut fans to make the pilgrimage. Among the artifacts you will see on display is his Purple Heart. He got a Purple Heart for frostbite. And he said, I earned the medal, and I fought in the war, and I thought it was a just war. I was a very small part of that. And a theme of his books is how we really don't know what we're doing. I don't think he understood. When Dresden happened, when Dresden was destroyed, he had no idea how that fit into any bigger picture. And when he came home, he looked for references to it in back newspapers, could find nothing, which added to its strangeness. And the war was absolutely central to his formation. I'm sure he suffered, not the first to say, from PTSD symptoms. Mark Vonnegut says that, his son, so forth. There's no question about that. But I think out of that, he comes out with a mission, having been a prisoner of war and having seen Dresden, etc., a mission to write a book about it, to tell his war story. And Slaughterhouse is interesting because, it took him 25 years almost to write that story, to figure out a language to describe this indescribable event in this traumatic time of his life, 6 months when he was a prisoner of war. And he said he talked to a lot of his fellow veterans, and it was a blank space in the memory. So the idea of being flashing back and time being very elastic and all that, that's the soldier's lot, certainly the prisoner of war's lot, and it's kind of the surreality of it. He finally figured out how to do the story, using realism and using humor, and also these science fiction Tralfamadore segments, these kind of three trajectories in the book. So it's a highly unorthodox war story, but he finally figured out a way to do it.
Yeah, and I think all of that made it even more human in some way by doing it in that style. Now, as we were saying, Slaughterhouse-Five, it's the semi-autobiographical account of him witnessing...
Yes.
But he did witness the firebombing of Dresden. Put us in Vonnegut's shoes. What would he have witnessed during the bombing, and really, why is it so controversial?
Well, Vonnegut and at least 100 other Americans were captured at the Battle of the Bulge. They were sent eastward to Germany, which needed workers, and about 100 Americans were billeted in a slaughterhouse, which had multiple layers, concrete, I think, going below ground. And for about a month, January to February of 1945, in the last days of the war, the Battle of the Bulge failed. Germany is going to be beaten. Vonnegut remembers Dresden, this 18th century Baroque city, which he saw as they were marched around, and they were making supplements to vitamins for baby food, I think. They were doing something non-war related. Vonnegut described it as like an Oz. It was like this magical place that he saw for about a month. But then on the night of February 13th, they were underground in their reinforced slaughterhouse, Schlachthof, pardon my German, not so good. They heard this rumbling above ground, and they came back up, and the city was gone the next morning. This was a British operation primarily, maybe payback for Coventry and the Blitz. The firebombing of Dresden, waves of British planes and then American planes came along and basically burned the city down, the central city. The death toll is debatable. Some say 40, 50,000. Some say 200 plus thousand. Who will know? It was packed with refugees.
Somewhere in between, probably.
Vonnegut said when he came up with the other guys, he said, there's another line I like. So, seeing Dresden destroyed, he said, it was a terrible thing for an architect's son to see. And so he saw, this European culture that he so admired, and the humanity, and the war's over. He always maintained this was just either revenge by the Brits or sort of an automatic, we bombed every other city in Germany, let's just do this one now. And he said the destruction of Dresden or largely the destruction. He said it didn't advance victory by a single second. It didn't release a person in a concentration camp a millisecond earlier. It interrupted some train traffic for like 2 days. It's the damage it did to the war effort for the Germans was minimal. He said it was a waste. It was sort of gratuitous. And then when he came back and didn't see it in the newspapers, he said, this is when I began to realize, and some of my mates, that our government could lie to us, that it could hide things, that history was full of all these hidden. Of course, now we talk about the good war. And I think young people are a little surprised that even in a good war, the good guys, us, we did bad things. And Vonnegut found Dresden, which he was survived by accident. He should have been dead. He survived it and wrote about it. I think he thought it was gratuitous. In fact, again, very in his usual blunt way, Vonnegut said in an interview, the destruction of Dresden did not speed the end of the war by a second. Nobody profited from that act except for me. He said, I made about $3 per corpse. I think he said that in 1973. So again, it just shows you he was not a Luddite. He liked technology in many ways, worked for General Electric. He had a scientific cast of mind, but he saw the dehumanization that went with the technology, the killing technology of the war. He saw it up close. And I say he sees it in a way most Americans, we don't experience being at the business end of bombs. And so in a way, his writing in Slaughterhouse-Five, it's more reminiscent of, Primo Levi, people who are under great suffering in Europe in a way that Americans back home don't experience. So I think it was the gratuitousness of this very late in the war action by British and American air power. And then he was appalled months later when he was back in home when Hiroshima and Nagasaki came along. I think this cured him of the kind of utopian technological optimism that he'd grown up with in the 30s. He said, technology was going to save us and television and all these wonders. He saw the bad side of it there, and that, of course, comes out in all of his books.
You're an expert, Greg, on World War II, and so there's opposing views on the necessity of it. What do you think? Was it a military necessity?
I maybe I'm just influenced by Vonnegut. I think it was fairly neat. I tend to agree with Vonnegut's point of view. It did do some damage and was part of the larger. I think the bombing campaign did, of course, help to defeat Germany. But Dresden just stands out as a gratuitous act, and I tend to agree with that. Others disagree for various reasons. And there's an interesting wrinkle to this. Vonnegut had to be careful about this because people would come at, what about the Holocaust? What about these why are you so upset that these Germans, and he said, you got to be careful. I'm a German American, and I can't just be appearing to defend the Germans. But his answer to that, and I tend to agree, is it really did not shorten the war by any measurable, just a matter of days, perhaps. To me, it was needless. I think that it became kind of an automatic thing by 1945 to just continue to firebomb these cities. And Dresden had not really been hit. Its military strategic importance, I don't know about the wedding cake, but it was very minimal. Vonnegut liked to say, I'm a little bit like Mark Twain, his hero. He said, both of us have been identified with the enemy in wars. Of course, maybe Sam Clemens comically joined a group in Missouri and fought on the Confederate side for about 2 weeks and then lit out for the territories, went out west. So he was not much of a soldier, but he fought for the Confederacy, quote unquote. And Vonnegut was saying, well, you're a German American and you're writing about this terrible thing that happened to Germans. So he liked to say, Sam Clemens and I are both identified with the enemy in war, so we have to be funnier than most people when we talk about it.
But
I love those kind of connections.
Yeah. And I mean, that's just how he was about himself. He's just very self-irreverent. And but I guess, you can justifying it. They say, it was Germans, you shouldn't shed a tear. I mean, that was part of the Slaughterhouse book, book as well. Part of the deaths. I mean, weren't there American prisoner of wars? Weren't they killed as well?
There were not many, and his group of about 100. There were pretty minimal numbers, but the city was packed with refugees from Poland, from other parts of Germany. It was packed with, women, children, older people. And so that's why we don't know the exact, by any stretch of the imagination, the death toll and so forth. Couple of other things I want to say about that. Again, there's another twist because the neo-fascists and the skinhead element in Germany has embraced things like Dresden as this thing about Germans' victimhood and Germans' martyrdom. Vonnegut was appalled by any connection to that, and that was not his purpose in writing this book. Basically, he said no city should be bombed. Civilians should not be bombed. But it has become a bit of a political football in the very polarized conditions, particularly in East Germany, the eastern part of Germany, former East Germany. So, the right in Germany has played with this, and they probably invoke his name. The trouble with being a very well-known writer is you're going to be, recruited for all kinds of causes. This was as far from Vonnegut's purpose as you can imagine, but it has become a kind of symbol of Germany's victimhood. I think his main thing was A, no city should be bombed, and B, it didn't do anything. It wasn't practical. It didn't advance anything. It was so useless.
Didn't he help with the cleanup afterwards too?
Which again, and we're in the Midwest, we use indirection and euphemism, and I love his understatement. He describes the weeks. For several weeks, he and his fellow Americans were deployed as corpse miners. Mm. They went down into subways where people had been asphyxiated, and they had to run through with, something over their mouths so they could breathe, and they had to take the valuables. They had to stack up bodies in parks where they were burned, for health reasons. He describes that period after the bombing when can you just stop and just imagine what that was like to be 21 years old and to have these people looking at you and you're mining corpses for their valuables and their guns pointed at you. And he said, there were people watching us too. They were interesting too. They were cursing them. They were throwing rocks at them. So it's interesting to me how he kind of just describes that in very flat, euphemistic way. It doesn't really go into the details, but I challenge everyone to kind of pause when you're reading Slaughterhouse and just imagine what that really was like.
Very, very hard.
Recovering the bodies. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean that part. One of those scenes always kept sticking with me. Talking about how the gas coming up through the ground, and yeah, I mean it's he makes you imagine it.
The city had been turned into minerals. By the way, he was a good scientist. He knew what minerals were. He knew what flames would do and so forth. I think you asked me earlier what drew me to him. I also am from the less is more school. I like his economy of expression. And I would argue that Slaughterhouse-Five says more. It's a very thin book. He apologizes in the introduction to it. He said, I gave it to my editor, Samuel Lawrence. I apologize. The book's a failure. I tried to write my war story. It's just slapped together. It doesn't fit. It's a thin little book. It cost me a lot of pain to write it, but here it is. But I think that thin little book, says more and leaves more to the imagination than volume after volume after volume that have been written about World War II. I always put Vonnegut with his buddy, a fellow veteran, Joseph Heller, of course. Heller's Catch-22 came out in 1961, which was another kind of absurdist debunking of the good war myth that, everything we did was good. And then, so that's in 61, and then 69, by happenstance, in the middle of the Vietnam period, Vonnegut strikes gold with Slaughterhouse-Five, and it kind of bookends the 60s, and adopted by the Vietnam generation as kind of anti-war books.
Because it was 1969. I mean, that was the height of the Vietnam War. And that's a year after RFK and MLK, and I think it just came out at the perfect time, and its message was just ready to be digested by the masses.
Right, and this is something a lot of people, I don't think Vonnegut planned it this way, but the book was released even though no one showed up at Ayers department store in March or whatever of 1969. The book took off, became a #1 bestseller, really made his name, made him this iconic figure, recognizable even. How many writers are actually recognizable? It was released right in the sweet spot, post-Tet, during the Nixon period when, the revulsion against the war was growing. And it's kind of interesting, Vonnegut was considered sort of this guru for the young in the 60s, and he was adopted in this way, but he was a greatest generation guy. And he didn't really mean to write about Vietnam, although Vietnam does come into the story. He said, I'm just telling you my story of the Second World War.
Let's just take a quick brief pause for a commercial break. When The Mind's Eye returns, we'll be right back with Dr. Gregory Sumner and more on Slaughterhouse-Five and Vonnegut's life. The Mind's Eye is back with the one and only Dr. Gregory Sumner, giving us really just fantastic stories about Kurt Vonnegut and all the influences that he's had, good and bad, of course. And often, we call his masterpiece Just by Slaughterhouse-Five. I mean, that's just what you say. You don't say the whole thing, Slaughterhouse-Five or The Children's Crusade, A Duty Dance with Death. I mean, it's a little wordy, obviously. But I want to kind of stick with some of the history lessons here because there's a lot packed into there. Slaughterhouse-Five, we know the history about Dresden. The Children's Crusade, I mean, that's taken from a big historical moment. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, he breaks down in the beginning, the first part of Slaughterhouse-Five. He speaks autobiographically. He breaks down the wall and just says, I was trying to write this book, and I visited my old war buddy, Bernard V. O'Hare, in Pennsylvania, and we told some war stories with each other. And I was trying to get, what do you remember about the war? What do you remember about Dresden? And they're sharing these stories. And O'Hare's wife was downstairs. She came up at one point and just ripped these two old war buddies telling their war stories and said, I don't know what you're writing, but you're going to try to write something like the Frank Sinatra and John Wayne movies. You were babies when you were fighting that war 25 years ago. And you're going to write something probably that's going to glorify it and continue the cycle, and more babies are going to die in the future. And Vonnegut dedicates the book to Mary O'Hare, and this really was like a cold slap in the face to him. Like, yeah, I was a baby. We were children. And he says that night after hearing this, he stayed at their house. There was a copy of a history book about the Crusades, which I know a thimbleful about. But apparently there was one of the Crusades where young children were sent into battle. And it was particularly bloody. So he chose to call Slaughterhouse-Five as the title, but the edition includes the Children's Crusade. And that's, again, to emphasize these are 20-year-olds, 21, 22, 19. And it's actually does a disservice to think of them as these grown, fully formed men. These wars are fought by children, and that's the point I think he wanted to make.
Did you happen to see Peter Jackson's They Shall Not Grow Old, by any chance, the recent documentary?
I'm aware of it. I have not seen the documentary. I've read about it.
Oh, you should watch that because I just kept thinking about the documentary as reading, rereading the book. I think you would, it pretty much says, it illustrates the Children's Crusade, even though it was about World War I. But it's still, is reflective of the same idea of the Children's Crusade. You should definitely check that out. And, it talks a lot about, misconception, and that kind of shows and highlights some of the misconceptions about war and even World War II. And
so a big theme of Vonnegut's writing throughout is how to stay human in dehumanizing circumstances. And he wants people to understand that war is dehumanizing, even for the, quote, good guys. And it's even in technology, which is wonderful in so many ways. And when he worked after the war at General Electric, he marveled at the stuff that was being made there, the new technologies. But we need to worry about what technology does to us in terms of dehumanizing us. And I think toward the end of his life, Vonnegut died in 2007. He was concerned about the digital technology. And he understood that it brings a lot of things to our lives, but we tend not to think too much about what technology does to us that's not so good. And the advance in war in 6 short years, we're bombing cities right and left. We covered a lot of territory in 6 years morally. So dehumanization, and you need to fight against dehumanizing the enemy, dehumanizing people. There's so many things that's partly why we're so divided today in America. We're dehumanize people. This was probably his greatest theme, and war is dehumanizing. That was his message.
Talk about some of the other bigger themes of his book, because it was an anti-war book, but there's so much more there. I mean, there's free will, there's fatalism. Talk about some of the linear themes that go through his books.
Well, one that comes to my mind is what happened to these children, the 12 to 16 million guys, men, Americans who came back after the war. What happened to them? Where they were kind of told, well, move on now. Let's not dwell on the past. In Blue, let's see, I'm trying to remember. Yeah, I think it is in Bluebeard. This guy had gotten married coming back from the war and had a family and had a job, just like Vonnegut, and it all fell apart ultimately. And somebody asked him, why did you do those things? Why did you come back and get married and have children and try to live this suburban life? What happened to these veterans? And the main character is Rabo Karabekian, an Armenian-American painter. And he says, that's the way the post-war movie went. We were expected to come back from that war and get jobs and be good companions and get married. And Vonnegut did marry his high school, sweetheart, Jane Vonnegut, and they'd had a family, and he suddenly was a breadwinner, and he struggled to do that. He did all those things, but while carrying around the weight of the war. And he said things like, we were expected to know how to be businessmen and breadwinners. We're supposed to know more about sex than the Harvard Medical Encyclopedia. The pressures on men, which is sort of a dirty little secret of World War II. And many other veterans have talked about that. They had to come back and they were strong and so forth, but they faced a whole new different type of pressure when they came home. And a lot of them were not too happy. And I think Vonnegut wasn't in some ways. That's a recurring theme, the pressure on men to live up to, their roles. And also with that is a little bit of fear of women. The women in all of Vonnegut's books are healers, but also they're capable of destruction. And who knows how much that's rooted in his relationship with his mother. He idolized his elder sister who died young of cancer. He always thought she was the smarter, funnier, more artistic person. He felt a lot of guilt. And that's another thing that veterans bring back, even from this glorious ticker tape parade, World War II. He and Heller and Norman Mailer and a lot of James Jones, a lot of their writings, I think it's sort of forgotten about. The very great difficulties the veterans of the good war had coming back, men, and trying to be men. It was very difficult.
I want to stick with the family side for a little bit to kind of just discover a little bit more about him. What was his relationship with his wife like?
Well, he came home, I think, in early summer of 45 and married Jane, who he'd known in school, I think in September of 45. He followed the post-war movie. And by all accounts, they loved each other and had lots in common. And She was kind of this activist, very smart woman. I think she'd gone to, if I'm not mistaken, Swarthmore, an Indianapolis woman of great intelligence, etc. And then they had their first child in 1947, I think it was, or 48, a Mark, named after Mark Twain, the famous Mark Vonnegut. And then other children followed along. When he first came back from the war, when he and Jane got married, he studied anthropology at University of Chicago for a little while also working the police beat for a newspaper there and seeing all kinds of interesting things that he would write about, murders and accidents and things like that. He kind of moonlighted as a reporter, but he studied anthropology. Saul Bellow was another veteran who was at Chicago studying anthropology at that time. They had 3 children of their own, Jane and Kurt, and by the early 50s, he took a job. His brother, Bernard, the great atmospheric scientist, got him a job at General Electric, working as he called it a flap, working in public relations. And for several years, late 40s, early 50s, Kurt Vonnegut lived in Schenectady, New York, with his now growing family, 3 children. And I think he hated everything about that life, except, he was kind of a gee whiz guy on the technology. He didn't like that type of life. And he started writing some stories, which Knox Berger, a guy he knew from Cornell, saw some promise in one of his stories. I think his first story was Report on the Barnhouse Effect, which was published in the early 50s. And Vonnegut got hundreds of dollars for this one story, and then he started writing more. He quit the job. And moved to Cape Cod, living in a kind of ramshackle farmhouse. He's a family man, and he really subsisted. He had to make money, and he wasn't all that good at it in many ways. Sometimes, and he suffered from writer's block quite a bit. And I've looked at his writing process. Things that he makes look very easy actually came with lots of cigarettes, lots of filled wastebaskets, lots of frustration and effort. But he makes it look easy when it's working. That's something amazing about him. He tried various side jobs. I think he taught in a school for disturbed children for a while. I think he worked for one day with Sports Illustrated and walked out. He tried to say he was the second licensed sob dealer in the country, and he utterly failed at that. He wasn't a great businessman. Jane said of the 50s, when Kurt would write a few stories and the money would come in, we'd have a big party and the neighbors would come out. But then there wouldn't be anything for many months, and we'd eat cereal, for dinner. Then the other thing that happened is his sister died, and his brother-in-law, same weekend, in a kind of freak collection of accidents. We are all products of accidents, as is said in Sirens of Titan. And Kurt and Jane adopted 3 of the 4 children of his sister. So suddenly he went from 3 kids to 6 kids. And like you said, he wrote these books, Sirens of Titan and Mother Night, and he would go to cocktail parties, and every once in a while somebody would say, "You're a science fiction writer, right?" Which was basically like, a term of insult. You wanted to put him in that bin. He wasn't making much money. He wasn't very well known. It was a touch and go. When he finally hit the big time, 69, 70, and actually became wealthy, and then left his marriage too, as the kids had already left. He said, all this money that came in when I'm close to 50 had a mocking quality. I sure could have used it 10 years earlier because they really scraped things together for a very, very long time. And but he did start to make money. He was really, I think Slaughterhouse-Five, he was thinking about quitting writing. He wrote God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, which came out in 65. And then he got a gig with the fellowship to teach at the Iowa Writers Workshop. And that's where he learned interacting with these other writers. Here's how I can write my war story. I can fragment it. I can use these different trajectories. He figured out how to do it. I kind of think, though, had Slaughterhouse flopped at the marketplace, maybe we would have never heard of Kurt Vonnegut beyond a few, kind of minor cult books, maybe Cat's Cradle, and the stories he wrote for in the heyday, the golden age of the magazines in the 50s.
He could have died out. He could have been Kilgore Trout.
He said, yes, Kilgore Trout is an alter ego, and he is the failed writer I feared I was becoming. And of course, Kilgore Trout evolves and changes over time. Isn't his first appearance? I think it's in God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, and he changes appearance and circumstances. But yes, that the worst thing that can happen to a child of the Great Depression is failure. And money is a very charged issue, and he heard his mother screaming at his father about it in late nights, and it's a very charged kind of thing. But he said, if the writing hadn't worked out, I'd get another job. That's what we do. That's what Great Depression, writing doesn't work, I'll build houses or whatever. So it's a miracle that we know about him. It's a miracle that the book hit at just the right moment and reached its audience. Maybe every writer's popularity is a miracle, but I think Vonnegut might have been at the end of the string by the late 60s unless he hit it big somehow.
And often you do hear that about people who hit it big and become, iconic like Vonnegut.
Mm-hmm.
That, for example, Houdini, he was on the verge of quitting right before he just exploded onto the scene. So you do hear that often. And
it can work the other way, too. Like, I think Norman Mailer wrote this book, The Naked and the Dead, which made a big thing. And I think he spent the rest of his life trying to match that or something. Early success can also be a burden. In fact, success is a burden. And I think that's the lesson Vonnegut learned, looking at the people around him in the Depression years in Indianapolis, that people fail for no reason of their own oftentimes. And in fact, failure is just as or maybe more common than success in America, contrary to, kind of the American dream idea. He saw lots of failure, and that certainly haunted him, I'm sure.
And that's some of the themes that he would talk about in his books is the American dream. He would constantly kind of put a black mirror up to it of sorts.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you say black mirror. I think beneath it all, he was highly patriotic, almost sentimental. I love his Playboy interview from '73 in the middle of the Watergate crisis. Very revealing, interesting, entertaining interview. Every Vonnegut fan should read that. I think it's in one of the collections, Wampeter's Foma and Granfalloons, maybe. He was asked by the Playboy interviewer, very good interviewer. He was talking about his utopian ideas and his belief, kind of the socialist German forebears, and his opposition to the Vietnam War and his concerns about Watergate and Nixon. He called Nixon, he's also a child of the Great Depression, and unfortunately Nixon only learned the bitterest lessons of that. And, we suffered for that. He was asked by the interviewer, are you a radical? And Vonnegut said, I don't think so. In the middle of Watergate, he said, everything I believe in, I was taught in junior civics class at School 60 in Indianapolis, Indiana, in the Great Depression. And I just never learned junior civics. We were taught to admire and worship the Constitution. We were taught to feel that a militarist state, is wrong. It deforms democracy. I believe in all these democratic ideals. Everything I learned at School 60 in Indianapolis with full approval of the school board. We were idealistic in those days. And he said, and I got a very good grade. So, I think people who don't like Vonnegut's politics like to think of him as this sort of tear down the temples, bull in a china shop, anti-American. I think his love for American ideals, and part of that is the immigrant ideal, the German-American family. And he fought for the war and was proud, fought in the war and was proud of it. I don't think he did not consider himself a radical. He felt that the country was moving away from its ideals during Watergate. I thought that was very revealing.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why he was so critical is because he loved it so much. I mean, a lot of times, that those ideas that come from and they stem from your love. It's just you're seeing something so. And imagine what he saw from where he, from birth to death, the type of changes he saw throughout the country.
Michael Walzer has a book that I cite called The Connected Critic or Connected Criticism, and he traces this back to the Old Testament, and so the Jeremiahs who condemn what's going on because they love so much what the ideals are, and that's Vonnegut fits into that pattern of dissent. He was. I call him a brokenhearted American dreamer, and he'd learned certain things observing the Great Depression. He was also a rebel. He was the youngest of three. I think he was suspicious of the business world. He ran the high school newspaper, and then at Cornell flunked out working on this paper there instead of studying biochemistry. But an example, he said, I learned a lot of what I believe in from listening to radio in the 30s, Laurel and Hardy and the radio comedians. He said, my sister and I loved Dillinger. We were rooting for John Dillinger, a Hoosier, and we hated that bitch who, betrayed him in front of the movie theater in Chicago. He kind of liked rebels and outlaws, and, he does have that streak of rebellion for sure. But I think he was actually a pretty conservative person in many ways. He believed in restraint. He believed in kindness. He liked to dress okay. He's sort of old-fashioned, again, in ways that appeal to me as a Hoosier, I suppose.
And I want to jump back a little bit back in time to something that you mentioned before. And, as a host, we try not to jump back and forth too much.
We're unstuck in time.
Well, that's Brian. What I was going to say is that we're doing this in honor of Vonnegut, of course. And
it's not just veterans who are unstuck in time. We all do it. I mean, earlier today I was 5, and then I was 60, and then I was 12. It's the human condition, unstuck in time, but that's what we are.
And what is time? But we'll get back to that in a second.
So it's not linear. Yeah,
sure, not in my mind for sure. So you mentioned that he lost his brother-in-law and his sister in the same weekend.
Yes, and he loved his sister.
What happened? I never heard that before. I didn't know that it was condensed into that time frame. Tell us the story.
Yeah. This is, showed. I think he learned very early the how fragile life is and how things can. Fate. We're determined by our circumstances much more than we like to believe. We like to believe we're free agents. That's another key theme in all of Vonnegut's books: free agency versus determinism. His beloved elder sister died of cancer at the age of 40. Had 4 children with her husband, and she was dying in the hospital. This is about late 50s, 1957, something like that. Edith was his sister, named after his, I believe that's right. It's been a while since I've looked at the biography. I can't remember.
Well, listeners, don't bite his head off and think it's another name. He knows what he's talking about, the names. Yeah, so he loved his sister. His sister
was his role model and his they had almost a very, very close relationship. She was the funny one. She was the town woman. She's dying of cancer. And he wrote a book called Slapstick, a novel, which is really dedicated to his older sister. So she was dying, and so she's there. And just before she dies, her husband was on a commuter train, I think in New Jersey, the stockbroker special, and it went over a drawbridge, killed dozens of people, including her husband. So suddenly you had these, and then she died. They didn't tell her in her bed, and she died almost, within days of that, just by accidents, so I think that was quite a noble thing that Kurt and Jane did to take in. I think one of them was very, very young and went with some other part of the family, but they took in the 3 and suddenly went from 3 to 6 children. But his sister, she was she was the one he always talked about. And later on, when she died, and then Bernard lived a long life, but he said, when Bernard died, when my brother and sister died, I didn't have people to show off for anymore. He had learned to be funny at the dinner table. He had these two gifted elder siblings. And, you know, I think it's very important what we learn at very early age. You know, he just worshiped these siblings, and they both died. Bernard fortunately lived a long life. But, you know, it's almost crazy how he was killed on that train, or his brother-in-law. And a very noble thing, I think, to take on the children.
And again, we're here with Dr. Gregory Sumner talking about his book, Unstuck in Time, A Journey Through Kurt Vonnegut's Life and Novels. And how did his children and his adopted children describe him?
Well, for one thing, I think they all loved him and loved the house. And it was a really crowded house, and there was a lot of noise, and everybody in the neighborhood was coming in and out of the house. And a couple of them have described him. He was like, it was hard for him to work amid all these children. I don't know how he got any work done. I think one of the children, they all turned out well, by the way. But you know, he had a strange job. He would kind of lock himself in his study all day, every day when he was writing, leaning over that coffee table with the typewriter and the cigarettes and the wastebasket and papers all over the place. And so in many ways, he was a wonderful father. I don't think, if you talk to Mark Vonnegut, he loved his father so much, but it was tough to be Kurt Vonnegut's son, eldest son, a famous person. And he remembered when he wasn't famous, but to be the son of an artist or a writer, or the daughter of an artist, it's difficult, because he was, there was a remoteness to him sometimes too when he was working. So even though he was home, he wasn't like other dads who went off to work and came back, and he was around a lot, but he wasn't all that accessible in those times when he was trying to concentrate. And, you know, I think he loved the idea of family. The family was an ideal for him, and he really made sacrifices to make that happen, he and Jane. But I don't think I think it was complex. You know, like a lot of men, maybe, like a lot of fathers, he was absent, even though physically present. That might have been part of the PTSD issue. Who knows? Complicated.
And what about in his last days? Was he surrounded by, friends and family?
He, by the way, he was very, very gloomy in his last days about the country. I think George W. Bush and the invasion of Iraq, etc., just about broke him. And he said, back in my day, you know, he thought George W. Bush was like a rich kid with toys using the military. He said, that's not how my war was fought. He was pretty gloomy about it, but he still did appearances and still did some writing. He wrote for Seven Stories Press a book called A Man Without a Country, which actually became a bestseller and introduced Kurt Vonnegut in 2005 to a whole new younger generation of readers. I run into so many people who are in their 20s and even 30s now who said, yeah, I discovered him with this book a book of essays called A Man Without a Country, 2005. So he was still, you know, a major figure, and he appeared on, you know, Bill Maher's show and The Daily Show, but, you know, he was aging. He joked, he said, I was thinking about suing the cigarette companies. They told me I'd be dead by now. I don't think he liked being in his 80s, you know, but he had probably had some, you know, respiratory problem, but he was still active. He somehow slipped and fell. I think he was out on the steps, maybe having a smoke or something, hit his head in front of his townhouse in New York on East 48th Street, and went into a coma. And eventually it was Mark, the eldest son, who took him off the machine. So was he happy at the end? Was he ever that happy? He was very disturbed. God forbid if he could be around to see Trump. I just know he wouldn't like it. If he thought George W. Bush was bad, that might have killed him, you know. But he lived to be 84, and so he had this very, very strange life. I want to say one other thing about Slaughterhouse, by the way, and alert listeners. Slaughterhouse-Five was not beloved by everyone. It was banned, and it still appears when libraries have banned books week. Slaughterhouse-Five is right at the top. It's always mentioned. Kurt Vonnegut banned books, and the excuse was there are a couple of bad words in it. Soldiers use bad words. Actually, I think it's politics that some people didn't like. School boards. There's a famous incident. Do you know about this? In Drake, North Dakota, the president of the school board burned a bunch of books, including Slaughterhouse-Five, from the school library. And I would just alert anybody who's interested in Kurt Vonnegut as a writer and as a citizen. He wanted to be a good citizen. Again, he wrote a letter to the school board and said, "You must think I'm some kind of monster. I'm actually a real human being. I fought in a war. What you have done is highly insulting to me, and it does a disservice to your students." It's a great First Amendment piece of work that I think will appear in future books about the First Amendment. Look for his letter from the early 70s to the school board president of Drake, North Dakota, where they were actually burning Slaughterhouse-Five. Now it's part of the canon. Everybody reads it. I don't think it's the most representative book of his 14 novels, but it is the one that students are exposed to. And my point in what I've studied, and read the later books. I like the later Vonnegut. A lot of people dropped off after Breakfast of Champions. It was too much for them somehow, but that only made me like him more.
Exactly.
You either like it or don't like it. But,
exactly.
So I think the later novels are very profound, as he's sort of an aging man and he's facing mortality even more. And always felt a lot of guilt. I always felt like, why am I surviving? Survivor guilt. And why, I wasn't the smart one. My sister was. Things like that. Very complicated. But we love his transparency, don't we?
Mm-hmm. We're talking about his mortality, and how can we not talk about "so it goes," the phrase that's uttered over 100 times in Slaughterhouse-Five. And do you think that's indicative or reflective of his ideas about death? I mean, really, yes. The phrase was a kind of a sort of a comic relief, really.
Yes, anytime anything dies in Slaughterhouse-Five, he liked to use these little devices, sometimes with tongue-in-cheek. Anytime a person dies, and a lot of people die in Slaughterhouse-Five, he has the little phrase. And by the way, it's "so it goes," not "and so it goes." Mm-hmm. Remember, economy is important. The actual phrase is "so it goes." And I think famously, even they had a wedding party. Billy Pilgrim's daughter gets married, and the champagne went flat and died. So it goes. It is a comic device, and it's a little marker. But I think about that. It's a sort of fatalism. It is an acceptance of fate that you can't control everything. There's a fatalism to it. I wouldn't say it's a celebratory thing. To me, it's a statement of, we are determined and fatalism, but we carry on. We kind of carry on. And I think that kind of summarizes his whole philosophy. He had a lot of hard times in his life.
And what in Slaughterhouse-Five, he's constantly talking about UFOs and aliens, and then he also talks a little bit about werewolves and all that other stuff. What did he really think about? I guess the paranormal and. Well,
he used to joke. He had very mixed feelings about being in the quote science fiction bin. He liked science fiction. He was friends with Ray Bradbury and Isaac Asimov and all that, but he was more, he wasn't really a science fiction writer. He said of Kilgore Trout, I think in God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, the thing about science fiction writers is most of them don't know anything about science. And that's probably true. He actually knew quite a bit about science. I think... famously, he said there's this sort of illusion. He was a defender of our planet. He was called into CBS had him on. He was popular from Slaughterhouse-Five. CBS had him on for the moon launch as a little commentator. He came on briefly with Walter Cronkite, I think. And they were saying, what do you think this means, Kurt Vonnegut, about future travel and, colonies in space and maybe a habitable place on the moon? And Vonnegut said, essentially, how about a habitable New York City? And he meant the smog, the crime, all the bad things that were happening in late 60s, early 70s. And let me just say that went over kind of flat, and he was never invited back. He said, we don't know, but I think he said, what's actually out in space is death and a lot more death. And this thing that we're on is heaven. It is the Garden of Eden, and we are despoiling it, and we may not recover. Again, I don't know how he died 12 years ago. I shudder to think what he would think down the road, that we've not acted quickly. He said, we're good mechanics, human beings. Maybe we can fix this thing. Maybe we can fix the earth and make it work right. But he didn't really believe in the paranormal. And he said this illusion is actually dangerous, that, we'll kind of use up this planet and then we'll go to another one. He said that's a really, really dangerous idea. So I think in Slaughterhouse, he was using it as a sort of to break up the narrative and fragment it and show how time travel, crazy stuff. But I think he was actually a pretty practical person who didn't have much truck with the unknowable.
Well, I think he might have actually traveled in time, because in one part of Slaughterhouse-Five where he's talking about how Billy Pilgrim's wife died, and saying that on one of the bumpers of, I guess, one of the cars involved, it said, and there was a bumper sticker that said Reagan for president. So I don't know, maybe he did travel in time.
Yeah. He did think that time was not linear, and then we create it with our minds, and that's the whole unstuck in time thing. Vonnegut, sometimes he's portrayed as a Luddite, and I think he really was highly suspicious, and I think people should know about the digital age. He said, I think the information superhighway they're talking about here in the late 1990s, it's going to have a lot of sensors and a lot of roadblocks and stuff like that. And he was all about face-to-face interaction. And I think he would not like a lot of the ways that we've used the digital stuff. But he was not a Luddite. He was trained. He studied mechanical engineering as a soldier. His brother was a scientist. Famously, Vonnegut, again, a great aphorism, he said, the difference between me and most other writers is I know how my refrigerator works. So, he liked gizmo. He grew up in the 30s. It was all about, the 1939 World's Fair, the world of tomorrow. He was kind of brought up on that. Now, World War II cured him of that stuff to some degree, but he was not a Luddite. He liked technology, but he worried that human beings didn't pay attention to what it was doing to them.
I think that was one of the biggest takeaways that I did get from the book. Not only that idea, but how much, from Unstuck in Time, that he really did have a science background, more so than you would even realize. For me, that was one of the most surprising aspects that I didn't realize before reading. What about you in researching? What do you think was the most surprising thing that you found out about him?
I think Vonnegut sometimes seen as a relic of the 60s. He was embraced, by the counterculture and by the anti-war people. But I don't think he admired them in many ways, but he didn't like kind of wildness. I think there's some famous stories about how kids would show up on his lawn, after Slaughterhouse, and they can be standing there waiting for him to give them the answer. And he'd say, get off of my lawn. He was kind of an old-fashioned greatest generation guy. But it's interesting. You think of veterans from war. He was of the left in a way. He was a progressive World War II vet, but he was a World War II vet. Very down to earth, very practical. And I do have to say some Hoosier values are in there. When you're from Indianapolis, you're a very grounded person for the most part.
Nothing wrong with that.
And I think, like you said, you're from New York. He came from the provinces. He didn't grow up in the center of the culture. So he's a frontier guy, almost like a Mark Twain and some of our, Hemingway and others. The fact that, so I think actually I find him to be, maybe that's the most radical thing to be, is to be sort of a conservative type person, not in the Fox News way, but in a way of trying to preserve some things that we need to preserve and not embrace change mindlessly. And to remember, I think the very act of remembering. So I think his conservatism, his patriotism shines really quite strongly through. You know, the right thinks they own patriotism. And I would put up people like he and William Styron and others who they lived through World War II, and they had different, you know, not this kind of knee-jerk kind of my country, right or wrong, and so forth. So, yeah, he's a Midwesterner, a broken-hearted American dreamer, not a slash-and-burn revolutionary. And, you know, so there are a lot of myths about him that he's a relic of the 60s. And I think the fact that he's still being read and rediscovered by younger generations today shows that he transcends the 60s. I run into so many people. Oh, you wrote a book about Kurt Vonnegut. I used to read him. And like I say, a lot of people dropped off with breakfast or something. And like it's kid stuff. He said, people say my writing is sophomoric. He embraced it. He said, well, if asking basic questions that most people think are already settled is sophomoric, I guess I am, you know. So there's a childlike quality to him. There's an openness, but also, and I don't want to soft pedal, there's a dark side and a light side. There's a tragic element to it. But throughout, I guess I tend to agree with those who say he was actually an optimist disguised as a pessimist, but I can't speak for how he would be under today. I think that might have flipped. And I agree. George Saunders, who's a very popular writer now, says Kurt Vonnegut is the essential writer of the 20th century. I view his 14 novels in my book, Unstuck in Time, as like a diary of the 20th century by a very interesting guide. And but it's more than that. I think it certainly points us in directions today. I think there's a timeless quality. And I don't, you know, he would not like me to say he's the Mark Twain of the 20th century, but there are some connections there. I think he's much more complex and much more timeless than most people understand, and he's not kid stuff, although a lot of it is very enjoyable. You read Vonnegut, you're going to bust out laughing a lot, even if the world is ending.
It's so beautifully said, so very true, Greg. And I know that your book Unstuck in Time came out a while ago, in 2011, and you know, I guess it probably seems like yesterday in some ways, and maybe even 50 years ago as well, in other ways. But what are you working on now? Is there anything that's kind of gestating, or what's happening next on your front?
I keep writing books about World War II, and I have a new book, again, which is a tribute to American soldiers in World War II, and also involves a Hoosier. There's a fellow named Ernie Pyle. I don't know if you know the name. At one time, he was a household name, America's favorite war correspondent during World War II. He was killed at the end of the war, but he was with the soldiers. He had a column in 300 newspapers around the country. And he's a Hoosier from a little town called Dana, Indiana. Vonnegut liked Ernie Pyle. He never met him. He was famous. But again, here's another guy. Maybe here's a similarity. People kind of dismiss Ernie Pyle's dispatches from the war zone as kind of simplistic, kind of cornball, kind of forgettable. Some of it is. But I find great profundity in that kind of Midwestern voice. So I'm writing about Ernie Pyle through the Italian campaign, from the landings in Sicily to the liberation of Rome, 1943-44. And Ernie's a little dark. He was like 42 years old. He's an older guy with these young soldiers in the very tough fighting in Italy. So I needed a counter to him, and I chose Bill Malden, who wrote the Willie and Joe cartoons for Stars and Stripes, and was equally beloved by the troops. So kind of Bill Malden and Ernie Pyle and the Italian campaign, which is not as well covered as things like Normandy and North Africa. And I had a Fulbright teaching in Rome for 6 months, so I have a particular affinity for Italy. And I want that story to be told through these two kind of middle American type guys. So there's a lot of connection. As I look back, how did I choose it? I keep choosing topics that have some kind of theme. I think it's connected to Vonnegut.
The surprise, surprise, right? And I'm sure you'll figure it all out a little bit later on, how it all sticks together. Did you say that? No, please.
As Vonnegut has a character say in Cat's Cradle, Hoosiers rule the world. Everywhere you look, there are Hoosiers in charge. I think he has a lady say that in Cat's Cradle.
Well, as a New Yorker, I might argue with you. As a New Yorker, I might argue with you, but that's kind of what we do. Yeah, right. So, but I won't this time since you were so gracious to come on the show. Great. Let's circle back and talk about that, because that sounds like such an interesting juxtaposition of characters of people that. And again, this is Dr. Gregory Sumner. We were talking about his book, Unstuck in Time, A Journey Through Kurt Vonnegut's Life and Novels. Greg, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It was a bit of an extended session. I don't think either of us thought it was going to last this long, but I really appreciate your time.
Brian, it's been great to revisit this stuff. I could go on for a long time, and I hope I didn't talk too much. That's a very Hoosier thing to say.
Well, I can listen.
Viva Kurt Vonnegut.
Well, let's drop it off. That's a perfect place to leave it. Thank you so much, Greg, and I look forward to talking to you the next one. The Mind's Eye wrap-up when we return. All right, ladies and gents, this Mind's Eye wrap-up's got to be pretty short and sweet. We're running out of time here. Hopefully everything was beautiful and nothing hurt tonight. The Mind's Eye on Z-Talk Radio and Stitcher Radio will return in a few weeks. And now this show is dead, and so it goes.